At the beginning of the movie, we are introduced to Dan Morgan, a devoted dad who works as a car salesman and lives with his physiotherapist wife, Jessica, and their 3 kids, teenagers Nina, Kyle, and the toddler Max, in the quiet suburbs of Buffalo. One day, Dan goes home early to celebrate their 18th wedding anniversary. Dan gets home and finds Jessica and Nina fighting over Nina's new choice of university. Jessica is annoyed that Nina is influenced by her boyfriend, Trevor, and wants to abandon her dream of attending Stanford University to follow him to Southern Iowa University. Then the family argues over who has to babysit Max when the parents leave for their anniversary dinner. Dan convinces Nina to stay home, babysit, and work on her applications while Kyle goes out to see his friend, Samir. Kyle goes over to Samir's house where he pays Samir to use his gaming setup because Dan has prohibited him from playing at home. Kyle is a popular online streamer. He gets online and addresses his many followers in the gaming world. Meanwhile, Jessica and Dan go to the Twisted Cyclone, a local amusement park where they met 18 years ago. They celebrate this way every year and ride the roller coaster. During the ride, Jessica lovingly tells Dan that even though she appreciates his reliability and organizational skills, she misses spontaneity and doing fun things as a couple. The couple reminisces about their almost 2 decades of marriage and share how much they love each other. Then, as the couple share a kiss, a group of young men make fun of them and take their picture. Dan approaches their group and politely asks their leader to delete the picture. Instead of apologizing for interrupting the couple's private moment, the leader taunts Dan, makes rude comments about Jessica, and posts the picture online. Dan holds back his tongue and takes the abuse. This ruins Dan and Jessica's romantic night, and Jessica tries to comfort Dan on their way back home. Later, Dan takes a moment to think about what happened and to analyze how he got to this point in his life. A few days later, Jessica meets a travel agent named Gwen at her gym and goes out for coffee with her. The women chat and get to know each other. Gwen shares that she is in Buffalo to see her ex-boyfriend, while Jessica shares how much she wishes to travel and yearns for excitement in her mundane and predictable life. A couple of days later, while Dan is shopping at a supermarket with Max, he notices a suspicious man following his every move. The man follows him and attacks Dan, which causes a big scene. Dan fights back as best he can with Max in a carrier. Max enjoys the scene thinking it's a game. Dan manages to subdue the highly trained attacker and leaves unscathed.
I told you, let me put my kid down!
Dan then leaves the supermarket and rushes to his house. Inside, he runs around gathering things from everyone's room. Dan calls his former friend and associate Augie to ask him about what happened and to ask him to prepare new passports for him and his family. Augie suggests that Dan's former employer McCaffrey was probably behind the attack, advises him to disappear, and offers to meet him in Las Vegas with the new passports. Dan grabs the kids from school and takes them to see Jessica at the physiotherapy center. There, Dan explains to Jessica that he has planned an impromptu trip to Las Vegas like she always wanted. Jessica is shocked at first, but after some convincing, she gets on board. The Morgans start their trip, but after driving a few miles, Dan notices that they are being followed. He manages to lose the car following him, locates the tracker under the car, removes it, and puts it on his very annoying colleague, Hal's car.
Yes.
Ready?
Are we going to Vegas, or are we just going to live up here?
The Morgans start the 33-hour drive to Las Vegas. Dan realizes that his enemies probably found him from the picture the bullies at the amusement park took and posted online. Then, a few miles outside Buffalo, Dan tells everyone that they should use the trip to come closer as a family and bans the use of any technology so that the family can spend time with each other in real time. He then collects everyone's phones, including his own, and throws them out of the window. Dan is forced to stop at the nearest travel agency and bribe the cashier to find maps and make reservations. Meanwhile, McCaffrey goes to Dan's house in Buffalo and searches it inside out, trying to find clues as to where the family is headed, but comes up short. And so he calls on all his men and orders them to do whatever it takes to find Dan. In the evening, Dan takes the family to a motel to rest for the night. Then as Kyle steps out of the car to stretch his legs, a girl recognizes him from his online gaming persona and tells him how much she admires him. The girl then asks Kyle for a picture and he happily poses with her. Dan notices this interaction and freaks out when he realizes that the girl is going to post the picture online. Dan realizes they have to move, gets the family back in the car, and continues driving while the rest of the family dozes off. As Dan drives, some men follow him on motorbikes and attempt to shoot him. Dan discreetly maneuvers the car so that he won't wake his family and tries to lose them, but the men continue to follow the Morgans and start shooting at their car. Dan uses a silencer to shoot and kill all of them, without waking up his family because they're the heaviest sleepers in the world. Dan continues his drive and the family gets to Iowa the next morning. Nina begs her parents to visit Iowa State University, and Dan agrees, thinking it would be good to stay off the road for a while. During the tour, Jessica reminisces about her good old times as an athlete before her injury forced her to quit. Kyle and Nina spend time with each other bonding, and Kyle tells Nina that she deserves someone better than Trevor. Then Dan sees a man who looks like he is out of place and goes to talk to him. As he proceeds with a plan to subdue the man, he realizes that he's got the wrong man and sees another strange man coming for him. Dan refocuses, starts an intense fight with the newcomer, and subdues him. Later that day, when the family prepares to leave the campus, Nina asks Jessica permission to see Trevor and goes to his dorm. However, when she gets there, Nina is devastated to catch Trevor cheating on her and returns to her family in tears. Then Dan uses his quick thinking and teaches Nina Jitsu, a technique that uses people's pressure points to cause pain. Nina returns to Trevor's dorm and completes her revenge by using Jitsu on him, causing him to fall on the ground, screaming out in pain. Then the family leaves the campus and continues on their way to Las Vegas. After a few miles, Jessica and Kyle fall asleep while Nina takes over the driving from Dan. Dan and Nina take this time to bond, and Dan tells Nina how proud he is of her. Later that day, the Morgans are excited to get off the road after 2 days and head to a motel for the night. The next morning, Dan calls Augie and sets up the details of their meeting. Then Dan and Kyle spend some time together, and Kyle explains what gaming means to him. Kyle then challenges Dan to a game of laser tag and bets that if he wins, he gets to keep streaming and gaming online. Dan accepts the challenge and has a blast with Kyle in laser tag. Dan ends up winning and impresses Kyle.
Go easy on me, buddy.
The road trip continues, and the Morgans spend more quality time with each other, teasing and having fun with one another. Dan and his family finally get to Las Vegas. Dan leads his family to the fancy hotel he booked and into the penthouse suite. Jessica and the kids are excited beyond belief at the luxurious suite and take time to appreciate their room. Dan uses his opportunity to run downstairs to meet Augie, who gives him the new passports with the new identities. Dan shares with Augie that he plans to tell the truth to Jessica over dinner that night. Later that night, Jessica and Dan dress up and prepare to go out for a romantic dinner. They tell Kyle and Nina to babysit Max and warn them to never leave the suite. As soon as they leave, Kyle and Nina leave and take Max with them as they go out exploring the city and enjoying themselves. Then Kyle begs Nina to join him at a popular gaming arena called HyperX, and she agrees. There, the gaming community recognizes him and tells him how much they admire him. Kyle is then given a spot in one of the teams and asked to compete in the final round of a game. He accepts happily and starts playing while Nina hangs out with one of the gamers. Meanwhile, Dan and Jessica share a romantic dinner, but Dan can't find the right moment to tell Jessica his secret. After dinner, the couple spend some time playing some games, betting, and enjoying themselves. Dan calls the suite to check on the kids and is alarmed when he finds no response. He informs Jessica of the situation and returns to the suite to see if the kids are all right, but the kids have made it look like they're in bed, and so the parents are relieved. Then, as they proceed to spend a private moment with each other, they are shot at, and a man takes hold of Jessica. Dan starts shooting back, and to the utter shock of Jessica, Dan expertly disarms and kills all the intruders. Realizing that the kids are at HyperX, Dan and Jessica rush there and find them safe, and Kyle is being cheered on for winning the tournament. Jessica and Dan rush the kids out of the arena, and as they proceed to leave the area, they are attacked by more hitmen. The kids are incredibly stunned to see Dan defend himself by professionally killing everyone. The family escapes to a small motel where Dan finally reveals that his real name is Sean and that he is a trained government assassin. Sean goes on to explain that he was employed under McCaffrey and was assigned and carry out discreet government operations. Dan further explains that, after a few years of working with McCaffrey, Sean noticed that his boss had started assigning his team private operations and was selling their services to the highest bidder as mercenaries. Dan then explains that he left his job as soon as it changed direction and has been in hiding from his former boss, who has been looking for him for the last 18 years. Then, Dan gives everyone their new passports and tells them that their life in Buffalo is over and that they will head to Canada to start over soon. Jessica and the kids are overwhelmed with confusion and anger. Jessica then tells Dan that she doesn't know who he is anymore and decides to take the kids and leave the next day. Later that night, Jessica calls Gwen and asks her to make travel arrangements for her and the kids. The next morning, Jessica takes the kids to meet Gwen and is surprised to see her waiting for them on a private plane. Once inside, Gwen reveals that she is Dan's ex-girlfriend.
I thought he was the one, and then he just threw it all away.
And that she works for McCaffrey, who reveals himself from the cockpit and takes the family hostage. McCaffrey calls Dan, updates him on the situation, and asks to meet him at a hotel to negotiate the release of his family. Dan hurries to the hotel, and McCaffrey's men tie him and take him to the suite where Jessica and the kids are held, supervised by Gwen and McCaffrey. Then McCaffrey reveals that he is Dan's father and asks Dan to leave his family, never to contact them, and go back to work for him in exchange for his family's safe release. Dan is forced to accept the terms, and Jessica and the kids are transported out of the room to be sent back to Buffalo. Once in the elevator, Jessica attacks the guard escorting them and returns to the suite with the kids. Dan uses this distraction to disarm everyone in the room and goes after McCaffrey, who has already left the room. Gwen follows Jessica and the kids to the roof, and an intense fight ensues between the women, which Jessica manages to win, killing Gwen. The Morgans run downstairs to find McCaffrey standing over Dan pointing a gun. Nina distracts McCaffrey and gives Dan enough time to attack and kill him. 6 months later, Dan and Augie run a security company, and Jessica has started coaching athletics, while Kyle has returned to his gaming. The movie concludes as the Morgans prepare for their upcoming road trip to California to take Nina to Stanford. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.